Okay, now it's question time, okay? I want to ask you all questions about how often you should feed. So the first thing, yeah, well, because you all hear different things, and some of you hear you should establish a routine, others hear you should feed on demand, and so on. So who's prepared to tell me what feeding on demand means?
Never the baby cries.
Yeah, that is the answer I wanted, and it's wrong. Okay. So thank you so much for saying that. The correct answer is that feeding on demand means feeding your baby whenever she cries because she's hungry. So babies cry for all sorts of reasons, and hunger's only one of them. So if you assume every time she cries that she's hungry, you'll regularly find you're trying to feed a baby who's actually crying because you didn't wind her properly, or because she wants to go to sleep and you're too busy fiddling thinking she needs more food. So the difference between feeding on demand and routine is if you try and establish a routine, you come home from the hospital absolutely determined to feed your baby at certain times, let's say once every 4 hours. Now this is not fair on the baby, and it gives the wrong messages to your breast. So you need to be flexible, and that's what demand feeding's about. So most people say, exactly as you've just done, demand feeding means being totally baby-led. So whenever your baby cries, you feed. When she falls asleep at the breast, you put her down. If she's awake 20 minutes later, you feed again. The trouble with that is everyone gets in a muddle, and you haven't a clue why your baby's crying, whether she wants food or whatever. So because I know that none of you can distinguish from your baby's cries in the early days, it's no good me saying to you, feed her when she's crying because she's hungry, because immediately you'll all put your hands up and say, well, how do I know? So the best thing is to follow vague guidelines. So my guidelines are that although you're aiming to feed your baby every 3 to 4 hours, you need to be a bit flexible. And the minimum amount of time that you should allow the baby to go in between feeds is 2 hours. That's because very few babies are going to be starving hungry within 2 hours of the start of the previous feed. You always time feeds from the start, not the finish. So if your baby wakes within 2 hours of the start of the previous feed, don't immediately think food and stick her back on the breast. Look and see, could she just be winded? Could you rock her back to sleep? Has she possibly done a dirty nappy, and if you change her, she'll then go back to sleep? So try not to feed her. Obviously, if she's screaming her head off and you can't settle her in any other way, well then of course you feed her. Once the 2 hours are up and she starts crying, well then you could start thinking of feeding, but you'd obviously be far less keen to feed at precisely 2 hours than say 2.5 hours. So it's just a question of being flexible. So rule is, try not to feed within 2 hours of the previous feed. Don't let your baby go longer than 4 hours in between feeds, because every baby needs about at least six feeds in 24 hours. And if your baby's going to do a 5-hour stretch in the middle of the day, you are guaranteed that she's going to do a 3-hour feed sometime later on, and it will probably be in the middle of the night. So not more frequently than every 2 hours, don't leave her asleep longer than 4 hours, but be a little bit flexible. And that is what demand feeding is about.